A 26-year-old CEO murder suspect Luigi Mangione waking up at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn this morning, where he's expected to remain until his next federal court appearance on January 18th.
However, he could go before a judge on state charges before that. As for his charges in Pennsylvania, that case won't get underway until the proceedings in New York are complete. It's a lot to keep track of, and I know a lot of you are focused on this. Here to make sense of it all is criminal defense attorney Bernarda Villalona. So great to have you back, Bernarda, to talk about this. Let's discuss first and foremost what exactly played out yesterday, because, I mean, we got from our sources that all of a sudden he was going to a federal building, which wasn't what was expected. Everybody was set up outside 100 Center Street, which we all know is where a lot of the local court cases take place. So what happened?
Complete chaos. And what I think really happened is that the feds and Alvin Bragg, they're duking it out as to who's going to prosecute Luigi Mangione, because it was planned yesterday that he was supposed to be arraigned on the state charges. Remember, he's been indicted by a grand jury here in New York County. So because he's been indicted by a grand jury here in New York County, now it's time for him to be arraigned. But instead, the feds took him and they lodged a criminal complaint, meaning that case hasn't been presented to a grand jury yet. Instead, they put him in front of a judge to tell him what the formal charges are and let him know that, of course, he's entitled to counsel, which he did have counsel there, and set another date. In fact, they're not even contesting the detention yet on the federal charges. So right now, we're waiting to see who's going to take precedent, who's going to take the lead as to the prosecution. But what Alvin Bragg said yesterday is that he intends to continue with his prosecution. So we're going to see parallel prosecutions with the feds and with the state.
Which means that this could really drag on. I mean, before they can even get anything underway. And then, like you said, who decides which case takes precedent?
Exactly. So you have to think. But again, the one that so far is advanced is the New York County case, because it's been presented to a grand jury already. So it's already met the initial stages. However, he has to be presented in front of a judge formally so he can be arraigned on that indictment.
Right. But how do the charges differentiate between the federal charges and the state charges? Because how do they differentiate in terms of what the penalty could be?
Well, huge difference. So in New York State, there's no longer a death penalty. So in terms of the charges on the New York State charges, the max that he faces on the murder in the first degree is life without the possibility of parole. On murder in the second degree, the maximum is 25 years to life with the possibility of parole. However, if we move on to the feds, if he is convicted, he will face life without any possibility of parole. But more importantly, there's an option of the death penalty. But of course, there's several stages that you have to go through before the death penalty as a penalty is even approved. And that ultimately is going to come from the president. And it's not going to be from President Biden, but instead under President Trump and whoever the attorney general is.
Right. Can you lay this out again, though? Because his attorneys, his defense team says the federal charges conflict with the state charges. Lay that out for us then.
Not necessarily. So because they're two different sovereign, let's consider it two nations. The feds is one nation and the state is a different nation. So yes, you can go forward with federal charges and state charges, even though they derive from the same incident. Here, that Brian Thompson was killed on December 4th. The charges are different. They don't conflict with each other, and they can both travel at the same time. Think about it. It's done often. For example, with Derek Chauvin and the killing of George Floyd. Federal and state charges. However, the state charges went first and then the federal charges. Ahmaud Arbery, state charges went first, then the federal charges went. But what you normally don't see, and I'm surprised here, is ultimately having been a prosecutor here in New York, is that usually there's a discussion between the state and the federal and be like, you know what, feds, I'll let you handle the prosecution because you are using resources, and it's redundant as well.
Yeah, can we talk about the arrival and just what it looked like? You know, usually the heliport in Lower Manhattan is for state dignitaries, the president, the Pope. We're seeing a criminal come out of a helicopter and greeted with such a show of force, right, from the state, local, federal level, plus the mayor, plus the police commissioner. Now, I did ask the mayor why he was there. He said, well, he wanted to let the city know that he was leading from the front and that this guy wouldn't be just welcomed in New York. But what'd you make of the scene? It was something we've never seen before.
Exactly. And I've had, as a foreign prosecutor, I have had defendants that have been brought from other states, and sometimes they are driven in a car from another state. Other times they're in the back of a regular commercial airplane. People don't notice, but yes, there's a person that's being transported for the purposes of facing criminal charges. But what we saw yesterday, and that's an enormous sign of law enforcement, and I think it was twofold. Number one, because Luigi Mangione has gotten so much notoriety and that people are actually going to his side, like giving him money, donations, and coming out in full support, I think it was for, number one, his protection, but number two, to make sure that no one's trying to take him or get him out of custody. So also for the protection of law enforcement. So that's why there was such a showing of law enforcement there present. And also to send a message, because he's getting so much notoriety, that look, this is not going to stop. Like, we're here and we're going to protect the citizens of New York. Like, this is unacceptable.
What does it likely look on the inside then for him? Because there's so much notoriety inside the jail right now, as far as security for him?
Well, you have to think, first off, he wasn't taken to Rikers Island. Instead, he was taken to a federal detention center in Brooklyn, New York, the Metropolitan Detention Center. So exactly where Diddy is. So that's where he's going to be held, at least for the time being. But what happens is when you have high-profile people in custody, persons in custody, they are separated from the general public. You rarely ever see them mixed amongst the general public, because the last thing that they want to hear is that something happened to that person while in custody. So they're separated.
Ask you real quick about the details of what we saw play out in the courtroom with these notebooks.
Yes.
Right? That was damning evidence. Now, there's DNA evidence and all the other stuff, but these notebooks showed a plan.
Yes.
And that he was, allegedly, that these were his notebooks, right? So is that damning evidence? How is the defense going to downplay that moving forward?
What is damning evidence, especially when let's think about it this way. When we first saw that video and there was nothing else, we was like, who could have done that? Who is that? We can't even identify that person by face. Now with that notebook and the notes that he also had, it takes identity off the table. So it's not about who done it. Instead, that notebook now gives us more insight as to what was on his mind when he decided to take a gun and fire twice into Brian Thompson. So it's damning for the defense, helpful for the prosecution. However, it does give us an argument that maybe there is an insanity defense, that because of his thinking, how his mind was working, that he was mentally disturbed. But I don't think that's going to win the day.
Just real quickly, because we're running out of time here. I mean, just based on that, it looks like he may have had a grander plan. Do you think his attorneys will ask for bail? Because so far they haven't.
You want to ask for bail because, as a defense attorney, it's just so much easier to defend someone when the person is not in custody. Just because, especially the Metropolitan Detention Center, you could be waiting hours to see a client, or you can show up and you're waiting hours and you don't see that client. And then the time is limited where you see them maybe for an hour or 2 hours. Sometimes you get to spend a couple hours. But then as a defense attorney, I don't have my cell phone. I don't have internet access. So you want the person out as opposed to in custody. Of course, the prosecution wants the person to remain in custody because it's easier to prosecute. Number one, you know where they're at, so there's no risk of flight, but also kind of sends a message to the general public.
Well, after that sight of just the walk, I don't know if
I've never seen that, especially for the mayor to be there.
Well, yeah, okay, Bernarda, thank you so much for being here. This case obviously is going to be, people are going to be laser focused on it, as are you.